You probably have a picture in your head. When you think about a medieval toilet, you imagine something pretty grim. Well, maybe it's just a bucket in a corner or a hole in the ground. You might think of people yelling a warning before tossing the contents of a chamber pot out a window down onto some poor soul in the street below. The general idea is filth, a complete lack of sanitation, hygiene, or any kind of system. We tend to see the entire period, hundreds of years, as one long, smelly, unwashed era. And in some ways, you're not wrong. For many people, daily life was a constant negotiation with human waste. There wasn't a separate, private bathroom in every home with running water and a flushing toilet. That idea would have seemed like pure magic. So, yes, the chamber pot was a very real and very common part of life. And yes, waste often ended up in places we would find horrifying today, but the story is much bigger than that. It's more complicated, and honestly, it's a lot more interesting. The idea that medieval people just lived in their own filth without a care isn't really true. They knew it was unpleasant. They understood that it smelled bad and could make people sick, even if they didn't understand germ theory the way we do. They didn't enjoy living in squalor, they just had different tools and different limitations. And across the medieval world, from the grandest castle to the most organized monastery, people were constantly trying to solve this very basic, very human problem. How do you get rid of the waste? The answer depended entirely on who you were and where you lived. A king in a stone fortress had very different options than a peasant in a wattle and daub hut. A monk living in a wealthy abbey had access to technology that a shopkeeper in a crowded city could only dream of. There wasn't one single medieval toilet. There were many. Some were surprisingly clever. Some were dangerously simple. But almost all of them were an attempt to create some distance between people and their own waste. So, the image of a world without any sanitation at all is a myth. It's a caricature we've created, partly from movies and partly from our modern perspective. We look back from our world of sterile bathrooms and complex sewer systems, and we see their world as primitive. But that's not fair. They were working with what they had. They were innovating with stone, wood, water, and gravity. They were creating systems. Some of those systems were private, some were public, some worked well, and some failed spectacularly. To really understand medieval toilets, we have to let go of our modern assumptions. We have to look at the different solutions they came up with. We need to explore the engineering of a castle toilet jutting out from a high wall. We have to walk the streets of a medieval city and see how it tried to manage the waste of thousands of people. We have to visit a monastery, a place of surprising order and cleanliness. And we have to look at the simple, everyday reality of the chamber pot, the most common toilet of all. When we do that, a new picture emerges. It's not a picture of pristine cleanliness. It's still a bit messy and it definitely smells. But it's also a picture of ingenuity, of people thinking, planning, and building. It shows us that they cared about their environment, at least the immediate one. They passed laws about waste disposal. They created specialized jobs for cleaning up. They designed buildings with sanitation in mind right from the start. So, were medieval toilets as bad as you think? The answer isn't a simple yes or no. The reality is far more human. Let's start in a castle. This is where you find the most famous, and perhaps most misunderstood, medieval toilet. It's called the garderobe. The name itself is a little strange. It comes from the French words for guarding robes. People use these small rooms not only as a toilet, but also as a closet to store their clothes and other valuables. The thinking was that the constant smell of ammonia from the urine would kill fleas, moths, and other pests that might ruin expensive fabrics. It was a two-in-one solution, a closet that fumigated itself. So what was a garderobe? In its most basic form, it was a small room or closet built into the thick stone wall of a castle. Sometimes it even jutted out from the wall, a little stone box hanging in the air. Inside, there was a stone or wooden bench with a hole cut into it, and that was it. There was no water, no flushing mechanism, there was just the hole. And beneath the hole, there was a long, long drop. The design was simple and relied on gravity. The waste fell down a vertical shaft inside the castle wall, where it ended up dependent on the castle's design. In many castles built near cliffs or water, the shaft emptied directly outside. The waste would just slide down the castle wall and fall into the moat below or onto the rocks at the base of a cliff. It was a direct and effective disposal system. It got the waste out of the living quarters immediately. You can still see the stains on the outside of some old castle walls, a faint record of where the garderobes were. If the castle wasn't next to a moat or a cliff, the shaft would lead down to a pit at the base of the castle called a cesspit. This was essentially a stone-lined hole in the ground that collected the waste. It was a less ideal solution because it had to be cleaned out periodically. But either way, the principle was the same. Get the waste as far away from the people as possible. Life with a garderobe wasn't exactly luxurious. These were not comfortable places. They were often cold and incredibly drafty. The shaft acted like a chimney, pulling cold air up from the outside. Sitting on that stone or wooden seat in the middle of winter must have been a miserable experience. And then there was the smell. While the draft might have carried some of it away, it could also blow the smell right back up the shaft, especially on a windy day. It was a constant battle between freezing air and foul odors. Garderobes were also surprisingly dangerous. There are stories of people, especially children, falling through the hole, but the greater danger came from the outside. A garderobe shaft was a weak point in a castle's defenses. It was a vertical tunnel leading right into the heart of the fortress. Attackers knew this. During a siege, a skilled and very brave soldier could try to climb up the shaft to get inside the castle walls. It would have been a disgusting and terrifying climb, but it was a potential way in. There's a famous, though probably untrue, story about a king being assassinated on the toilet. The tale goes that King Edmund Ironside was killed in 1016 by an assassin who hid in the cesspit below the garderobe and stabbed him from beneath with a spear. While historians doubt this story, the fact that people told it shows they understood the vulnerability of the design. You were literally exposed when you used a garderobe. Despite these drawbacks, the garderobe was a huge step up from a simple pot in the corner of a room. It was a dedicated space. It was a system that used the very structure of the building to remove waste. It showed a clear desire for hygiene and privacy. In a large castle, there might be dozens of garderobes, one for each important chamber. The king and queen would have their own private ones connected to their bedrooms. This was a form of medieval luxury. Having your own private, built-in toilet was a status symbol. It meant you didn't have to use a communal privy or a simple chamber pot that a servant had to empty. It was a permanent solution carved in stone. It was smelly, drafty, and a bit dangerous, but it was also a clever piece of engineering for its time. Life in a castle was one thing, but most people in the Middle Ages didn't live in castles. More and more, they lived in towns and cities, and a crowded city presents a much bigger sanitation problem. You can't just have 100 chutes dropping waste into a moat. A city has thousands of people packed into a small area. Managing their waste was a massive challenge, and one that city dwellers and their governments were constantly trying to solve. The simplest solution, and the one most people used at home, was still the chamber pot. But the real question was what to do with the contents of that pot. The stereotype of tossing it out the window wasn't entirely a myth. In some dense, poorly regulated cities, this certainly happened. People would shout a warning, something like "Gardez-l'eau," which is believed to come from the French "Gardez-l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water." Then they would dump the pot into the street. The streets of many medieval towns were little more than open sewers, with a central channel or kennel running down the middle to carry away rainwater and, well, everything else. But city leaders knew this was a problem. It was disgusting, it smelled, and they believed it caused disease. So many cities began to pass laws against throwing waste into the streets. In London in the 14th century, you could be fined for dumping waste from your window. These laws weren't always followed, and enforcement was difficult, but they show that people were trying to create a more livable environment. They were attempting to establish public health standards, so if you couldn't throw it in the street, where did it go? Many houses had a private privy, which was basically a small outhouse in the backyard or garden. This privy would sit over a cesspit, a dugout hole that collected the waste. This was better than the street, but it created a new problem. Sooner or later, the cesspit would fill up, and then it had to be emptied. This led to the creation of a very specific and very unpleasant job. The men who did this work were known as gong farmers or night soil men. They were only allowed to work at night, to spare the public the sight and smell of their labor. Their job was to climb down into the cesspit, shovel the human waste into buckets, and haul it out. The buckets were then loaded onto a cart and taken outside the city walls, where the waste was dumped in designated pits or sometimes sold to farmers as fertilizer. It was one of the worst jobs imaginable. It was filthy and dangerous. The fumes in a cesspit could be toxic and suffocating. Sometimes the walls of the pit could collapse, but because it was such an awful job, it was surprisingly well paid. A gong farmer could earn a good living, much more than a typical laborer. They were providing an essential public service, the medieval equivalent of a sanitation worker. They were the ones who kept the city from literally drowning in its own waste. Their existence shows a structured, organized approach to sanitation, even if the methods were crude. Cities also experimented with public toilets. These were not small, single-person stalls, but large communal facilities. The most famous examples were the public latrines built on bridges. London Bridge, for example, was not just a bridge. It was a street lined with houses and shops, and on the bridge, there were public toilets. These were multi-seated structures built out over the River Thames. The waste simply dropped directly into the river below. The flowing water was supposed to carry it all away. This was a clever idea in principle. It used the river as a natural flushing system. Dozens of people could use the facility at once. It was a free public utility, but it had obvious downsides. It heavily polluted the river, which was also the city's main source of drinking water. People downstream were effectively drinking the diluted sewage of those upstream. Again, they didn't understand germ theory, but they knew that foul water wasn't good for them. Over time, the sheer volume of waste overwhelmed the river's ability to wash it away, creating a stinking, polluted waterway. Still, the bridge latrine represents a major investment in public infrastructure. Someone had to design it, build it, and maintain it. It was a civic solution to a civic problem, a recognition that sanitation was a shared responsibility. City life was a constant struggle, but it wasn't a free-for-all. There were rules, there were systems, and there were people whose job it was to clean up the mess. While castles and cities were developing their own sanitation solutions, another group was quietly perfecting the art of waste management. Monasteries, in many ways, were the cleanest and most technologically advanced places in medieval Europe. This might seem surprising. We often think of monasteries as places of quiet prayer and scholarship, not as hubs of engineering. But the monastic life was built on order, discipline, and self-sufficiency, and part of that order was a deep-seated belief in cleanliness as a reflection of spiritual purity. Monks lived a communal life. They ate together, prayed together, and yes, they went to the toilet together. This required large, efficient facilities. The monastic toilet block was called a reredorter or a necessarium. These were not small, hidden closets. They were often huge, impressive stone buildings built with as much care as the church or the dormitory. A large monastery might have a reredorter with 50 or more seats, all in a long row. Privacy was not the main concern. The stalls might be separated by low wooden or stone partitions, but it was a very public affair. What was important was efficiency and cleanliness. And the key to this was one thing the monks often had in abundance: running water. Monasteries were almost always built near a river or a stream, and the monks became masters of hydrology. They would divert the water from the river, channeling it through a man-made canal or leat that ran directly underneath the reredorter. The toilet seats were positioned over this constantly flowing channel of water. The waste dropped directly into the stream, which then carried it away from the monastery, rejoining the main river downstream. This was, in effect, a water-powered, continuously flushing sewer system. It was a brilliant piece of engineering, a design that the Romans had used and that the monks preserved and perfected. They understood the importance of a good water supply and a good drainage system. When planning a new monastery, the layout of the water channels was one of the first things they would consider. The entire complex was designed around the flow of water, from the kitchens to the washrooms to the toilets. The reredorter itself was usually a two-story building. The toilets were on the upper floor, often connected directly to the monks' dormitory, so they could get to them easily during the night without going outside. The ground floor was the open channel of water. These buildings were also designed for ventilation. They had windows or vents to allow air to circulate, helping to keep the smell down. The monks also had rules about hygiene. They were required to wash their hands regularly, and dedicated washhouses or laver lavatories were often located near the dining hall and the reredorter. Compared to the cold, drafty garderobe in a castle or the foul cesspit in a city, the monastic reredorter was a marvel of sanitation. It was a system that dealt with waste immediately and effectively. It was a result of careful planning, good engineering, and a communal commitment to order. Of course, this technology was only possible because of the unique circumstances of the monasteries. They had the land, the labor of the monks themselves, and lay brothers, and the wealth to undertake such large construction projects. They also had the accumulated knowledge passed down in their libraries of Roman building techniques. The monastic toilet system shows us the absolute peak of medieval sanitation. It proves that the knowledge to create sophisticated plumbing and sewer systems was not lost during the Middle Ages. It existed, and it was put to very effective use. It stands in stark contrast to the more primitive methods used by much of the population. It reminds us that the medieval period was not a single uniform block of time. There were incredible pockets of innovation and intelligence. In the quiet, ordered world of the monastery, a surprisingly modern solution to an age-old problem was at work every single day. They didn't have flushing toilets in the modern sense, but in some ways they had something even better, a whole flushing building. We've seen the high-tech solutions of the monasteries and the clever engineering of castle garderobes. We've looked at how cities tried to manage their waste with public latrines and professional cleaners. But for the vast majority of people living in the Middle Ages, the toilet was something much simpler and much closer to home. For the farmer in his cottage, the baker in his small house, or the family living in a single room, sanitation came down to one essential object, the chamber pot. This was the toilet for the masses. It was a simple ceramic or metal pot, sometimes with a lid, that was kept in a corner of the room or under the bed. It was used by everyone in the family, day and night. It was convenient, it was private, and it was cheap. But it came with one major drawback. It didn't make the waste disappear, it just collected it. And every morning, someone had the job of emptying it. What happened next is where the reality of medieval life really hits home. In a rural setting, emptying the pot was relatively straightforward. You could walk out to the garden and dump the contents into a compost heap or a designated dung pile. Human waste, or night soil, was a valuable fertilizer. It was recycled back into the earth to help grow the next season's crops. It was a closed loop, a natural and efficient system. The smell was part of country life mixed in with the smells of animals and the earth. In a crowded town or city, it was a different story. You didn't have a garden, you might have a small yard with a cesspit, but many people didn't even have that. So the waste had to go somewhere else. It might be carried down the stairs and dumped into the central channel in the street. Or, if you were lazy or in a hurry, you might just open the window. This is the source of the Gardyloo image, and while it might be exaggerated in movies, it was a real problem in some places. It's why cities had to pass laws against it. The chamber pot was the great equalizer. The rich or poor, most people relied on one at some point. Even in a castle with garderobes, you would still use a chamber pot at night rather than walk through cold, dark corridors to find the toilet. The difference was that a king had a servant to empty his pot. A poor family had to deal with it themselves. This daily chore was a fundamental part of medieval life, as routine as cooking a meal or fetching water. So, when we ask if medieval toilets were as bad as we think, the answer has to be a yes and no. If your benchmark is a modern flush toilet, then yes, they were terrible. They were smelly, unhygienic by our standards, and often inconvenient. There was no magic button to make the problem go away. Dealing with human waste was a direct, physical, and often unpleasant part of everyone's day. But if we judge them by a different standard, by their own ingenuity and the limitations they face, the picture changes. They were not passive victims of filth. They were active problem solvers. The castle garderobe was a brilliant use of gravity in architecture. The public latrine on London Bridge was a major piece of civic infrastructure. The gong farmer was a vital public health worker. And the monastery's water-flushed rearward order was a system that wouldn't be widely surpassed for hundreds of years. These systems didn't disappear overnight. The end of the Middle Ages didn't suddenly bring modern plumbing. Sir John Harrington invented a flush toilet for his godmother, Queen Elizabeth I, in 1596. But it was seen as a novelty, an expensive toy. It didn't catch on. For centuries after, people continued to use garderobes, privies, and chamber pots. The basic principles of medieval sanitation carried on. It wasn't until the great public health crises of the 19th century, when cities became massive and diseases like cholera ran rampant, that society was forced to invest in the vast underground sewer systems and water treatment plants that we rely on today. The medieval world shows us a wide spectrum of solutions. It was a messy, smelly world, but it was also a world of clever ideas. It tells a story of people trying their best to create order and cleanliness in a world without the knowledge or technology we take for granted. Their toilets weren't just holes in the ground, they were reflections of their social structure, their environment, and their enduring desire for a little bit of comfort and distance from the most basic fact of human life. They were, in their own way, a triumph of engineering.